Hey everybody, Tom Barnas, Stories from the 78 podcast. Thanks for watching or listening wherever you're doing your thing, Spotify or Apple Music or the whole thing. Either way, I appreciate it very much. So, Stories from the 78, typically a podcast and website devoted to all things going on in Chicago, except when I travel. And for the longest time, I have loved Detroit, and it's a place that I've gone to visit time and time again to watch the Bears get their ass kicked by the Lions, or the Cubs get theirs by the Tigers. I've done a few stories over the years, and one of my favorite memories of Detroit, Michigan, is the story I did with WGN back in 2008, 2009, around that time, about Rodriguez, Sexto Rodriguez, Searching for Sugar Man, the documentary that came out at that time. It had all this buzz about this mystery guy that was forgotten and lost by society. And his music somehow finds its way to South Africa, right? And it becomes the biggest thing in the world. I mean, in South Africa, Rodriguez becomes as big as the Stones, as big as Bob Dylan. People revere this man. They love him, and he is unknown in the United States. And, you know, his music came out in the 60s, and it came out at a time when Bob Dylan was putting out things, and it kind of just got lost in the shuffle. And it was, you know, a pretty tragic story in terms of a career that could have been that didn't turn out in the States until these, you know, this documentary is made about these guys who are searching for Sugar Man, which is the name of the documentary. So if you haven't seen that documentary, you should check it out, because it is definitely worth a watch. And, you know, the documentary finds Rodriguez, and he is, I mean, one step above destitute. He's stripping metal out of houses in Detroit to make ends meet, and he's playing music throughout the city, and he's kind of a vagabond in Detroit, and he played a lot at Cass Cafe at the time. And I found a contact for him, you know, and this is when Searching for Sugar Man was just starting to get played at the festival circuits and whatnot. So it wasn't really known yet. It was on the cusp of it. I mean, there was an article printed out in the Red Eye, and if you're familiar with the Red Eye, the old newspaper, like before like Block Club Chicago, if it was just doing things about fun events going on in the city and not hard news, that's kind of what Red Eye was. It was like the thing to check out for concerts going on that weekend. It was like Metro Mix Chicago. I'm really dating myself, but it was just the thing to check out. It was like the Bible for the weekend of things to do in Chicago. And there was an article about this whole story. So I worked at WGN at the time. I pitched it to the news director. He loved the idea. I got Judy Garcia, who's a veteran reporter in Chicago with a lot of music ties in Chicago, especially with the blues scene, and Buddy Guy. And we went out there to Detroit, and we did a story on him, and it was just wonderful. And before I went to Detroit, I read all about it. I read about the city, about the downfall. I was always curious about why it turned out to be this joke for so long, about how bad it is and whatnot. And I, reading about the history of it, I fell in love with the city. And I love Chicago. But man, oh man, Detroit has a great story to tell. And even back then, you know, you're talking almost 15 years ago, doing a story out there, we ended up with one of the most iconic scenes in our piece was having Rodriguez playing on a rubble hill in the middle of the Packard plant right there in Detroit. And the Packard plant is long gone in terms of making cars. I mean, they stopped making cars a long time ago. So this factory's just been sitting there dormant forever and, you know, falling apart. But there was something epically beautiful about the ruins that were the Packard plant. And we had them out there, and we it was by accident we ended up there. We were at another location, and we had to jump to this one because the sound was too loud at the other location. We're like in an old hippie part of town where it was right next to the highway. So you know, it was getting loud to hear. So we ended up at the Packard plant because I read about all these cool spots, and we needed a spot that kind of signified his story and his sorrow and his struggle. And what better spot to do that in a place that was ruins, you know, but of what was great. And it signified his life, Detroit's journey at that point. And I don't know, there was just something about that time. It's one of my most favorite stories I've ever done in my entire career as a journalist. And I've done a lot of them, but that one sticks out to this day the most. And so I have this affiliation with going to Detroit in checking things out. And I wanted to be opposite. I wanted to do something different. So the wife, long story short, our air conditioning leaked, and it got the floorboards upstairs where the air conditioner was all warped, and we needed to go get new ones. And of course, when you renovate a house, you think I'm never going to need extra floorboards except for maybe 4, and I'll be good, right? Well, it turns out we needed like 11. And we did the floors like 4 years ago, and the only place they had it was a place in New Hampshire or Detroit, Michigan at Floor and Decor. So the wife and I said, what the hell, let's go to Detroit, let's get out of town for a little bit and drive to Michigan. It's a 5.5 hour ride. It's not that far. And we decided to have a little fun, and we stayed at the Detroit Foundation Hotel, and it is absolutely one of the coolest hotels to stay at in the United States. I would say it's as close to the I can't think. I've been up. This week is the DNC, so I've been up for a while. But the Chicago Athletic Association Hotel, it's like that kind of, but not as old and not as majestic as the Chicago Athletic, because that was built for the World's Fair, right? But the Detroit Foundation Hotel used to be the old headquarters of the Detroit Fire Department. So it has all these doors, these big doors, right, where the trucks we park, and it just went along like the street like this. It just like a hole on whatever street that was on, and the other street on an angle here, just park the cars. So the restaurant and lobby are inside that spot. It's called the apparatus room, and it has got all that subway tile in there, and it's stained from the smoke, and it's got fire poles, and there's a bar in the middle of it now, and you can drink and you eat and have dinner in this. It's one of the coolest rooms I've ever been in my entire life. And you feel Detroit. You feel the soul of a city in that room. And that's why it's so special. And I think it's great. And the rooms upstairs, they're built on the old office headquarters, the officer quarters and stuff like that. So nothing really left over from that, except there's the pay window, I believe, up on the second floor, or the third floor. The old pay windows there where all the firemen used to go and get their checks. They would go up there and get them back in the day before they were sent directly to your bank account. But it's just a cool spot. So if you're in Detroit, I would highly recommend staying at the Detroit Foundation Hotel. The food is excellent. And like I said, the vibe is great. And it's at the bottom of like Woodward Avenue, where it kind of falls off into the beginning of the Detroit riverfront, which is now one of the nicest riverfronts in the world. I believe it's number 1 in the US. And it's by no accident. They have worked really hard to make this city a city again, where they can be proud of their downtown. And you can. It is, I'm 44 years old, so I only have known Detroit as being not great. And for first 15 years of my life, that was what I felt about Chicago. It wasn't great. You didn't go downtown. A girlfriend's dad used to say that's where all the perverts were, downtown Chicago. And, it always kind of bothered me that people had this view of that. And then it really bothered me when I went to Detroit the first time, to see like the Bears play the Lions. And the downtown wasn't great. It was burnt out. There was empty buildings. You can see right through them. Woodward Avenue, I did all this research. Woodward Avenue is like their Michigan Avenue or their Park Avenue in New York. And it was just desolate. There was nothing there. There is now. And it was so fun. We had the best time. It's the second time I've gone to Detroit in 5 years. First time was to go see Bob Seger with my then girlfriend, now wife, as our third date. And we went to the Detroit Foundation Hotel, stayed there. So we liked it so much, we went back there again. And I did a story on the hotel. And that's what's up on the Stories from the 78 website. I did a whole week of all things Detroit. And outside of Detroit, outside of the hotel, rather, I went to the Michigan Central Station, the reboot of Michigan Central. And that is the old, and I remember this going for the story I talked about Rodriguez. You would see this building, this behemoth building, offset from downtown. I would say it's just beyond Corktown, where the old Tiger Stadium was, and you could see through the building. Much like if you're a Chicagoan, and you'll appreciate this. Do you remember the Google building that is in the West Loop now? It used to be like a refrigeration factory for years, and they left it like hollowed out for a year for it to defrost, and you could see right through it. That's what this building was, except it wasn't a refrigeration. It was the grandest train terminal probably in the United States when it was built in like 1913. It was beautiful, and it was like the gateway to Detroit. It was that beginning of coming from, let's say, you're coming from New York or Los Angeles, you hit Chicago, and then you hit Detroit, and then the next big one is New York. You know what I mean? And this station, I mean, I love Chicago and Union Station, but it has nothing on this place. I mean, this is the same architect that did the Grand Central Station in New York City. It's just beautiful. And it was in horrible shape, as horrible as the old post office in Chicago was. And Ford bought it, I think, like 4 or 5 years ago, and they put a decent amount of money into the rebirth of Michigan Central. And it is just this beautiful building that has been completely repurposed, and it has been a tourist destination ever since. And it's free. 2018 is when the Ford Motor Company bought this spot. And like I said, it has now become a tech hub, because that's what they really wanted this to be, because Detroit used to be the home of innovation for the United States. And that's where the cars were made. That's where all the World War II machines, for the most part, were made. And Detroit at one time was the richest city in the world during World War II when they were building all the war machines, right? Either way, it's a cool building, and they restored it back to the way it used to be from 1913, except for a few minor things, like they didn't put the restaurant back in there, but the space the restaurant was in is there, and they have photos to show you what it looks like, because it's an activation space now. There's an art gallery of old like prints of the years of Detroit, of things that have happened there. I don't know, man. It's just a really cool place. And I can sum it up best like this. So my wife and I are in there, and we're walking around, and we get into the main hall, and it's just beautiful. I mean, it's just beautiful. It's this cream color, lights shining with all the windows. They had to redo all of these windows, custom made. I mean, it was thousands of hours of custom work to get this thing back up and running, just because it was in such disrepair. And the Ford Motor Company, to their credit, they didn't dip out of Detroit and leave like everybody else basically did. They stayed along with other, obviously, car manufacturers, and they have doubled down on Detroit now as a tech hub, because their innovation lab is their innovation headquarters is Michigan Central. And the campus is beautiful, and the spot inside is beautiful. And the woman that I saw, she was probably in her 70s, and she's sitting down in a, one of the refurbished but original benches they had in there. And she just had this smile on her face, and you can tell the way she was looking at the building. She's just looking around, that that movie that you have in your head of what your memories are playing in your head, and you kind of just go to that space and you're staring off into space, and people think you're daydreaming, but you're just reliving memories in your head. This woman was doing that for a solid 10 minutes. I just kept glancing over at her, just looking at her and watching her. And she almost was crying, but not. She had that look like if you would just touch her eyeball, the tears would pour out, except she was with pride and a little bit of sadness, but more pride about and excitement that it was back. And in many ways, this has been the symbol of the rebirth of Detroit as a powerhouse American city. I mean, I believe at one time Detroit was called the Paris of the Midwest, because it is beautiful. And when you walk now down Woodward Avenue and I went to Tiger game, and you walk all the way back to the hotel, which is, it's a good walk, mile walk or so. You walk down Woodward Avenue, and you feel like you're in parts of Europe now. All the buildings are filled back in. There's a Lululemon on Woodward Avenue in Detroit. Well, the first time I went there was nothing. There was like a couple of like liquor stores, and that was kind of it. I'm not even exaggerating. That was what was going on in Detroit. And now you have that happening there. I mean, not that Lululemon is a signal of prosperity in the United States. Just to give you that example, there was other buildings that were closed down that have been reopened and refurbished, and the city is giving incentives for people to open up businesses there, and it's working. Like, you see that, and you're like, that's what every city should do for the part of town that they don't necessarily want to regentrify. They just want to get life back into it. Because, I mean, Detroit was left for dead. I mean, and there's parts of Detroit that are still left for dead, just like parts of Chicago or Los Angeles or New York that are left for dead, But like all the cities I talked about, Chicago, LA, they're doing more to try to bring back the cities, because there is a housing shortage here, and Detroit's got a lot of room for a lot of houses, and there's a lot of blocks that have one or two houses on it, and it's just empty land. But it's become a hot spot, and that's a story for another day. But Grand Central is the beginning It's like the second half of the rebirth of Detroit. They started with downtown, building it up, but we had a great time. We walked down. It felt like we were in Paris, in England, mixed with New York City, a little bit of Chicago, and the riverfront is outstanding. It's beautiful. So I don't mean to talk the entire podcast about Detroit when it's about Chicago, but I also went to a place called Buddy's Pizza, which is the birthplace of Detroit style pizza, the square pizza. Like, and I swear I'm not making this up, but Little Caesars used to serve pizza in squares back in the day. Like when I was at Payless East and it was like the day before Christmas and you had pizza party, that's what we would get. And it came in two, like the big long thing, and there was two pizzas in it and they were both square pizzas. That's Detroit style pizza, the square pizza. And Buddy started it in like 1948. And the reason why they're square is because the owner of the pizza place back then used the old, the miscellaneous trays of car parts. He would use that to make the pizza. And the way that the steel was made for these pans for car parts made the crust crisp in a very unique way. And that's what Detroit style pizza is, that buttery crust that's crunchy but also chewy at the same time. That is why it happens. There's a whole story about it. Just go to the website, I'm telling you. And the pizza is phenomenal. Buddy's Pizza. But go to the OG one because it's awesome. And, it's not in the best part of town, but because it's like, I think it's on 6 Mile Road, which is called something else as well. Like in Chicago, certain roads are called like 4 different things. This is one of them. But if you go up that way, let's just look up Buddy's Pizza, original location, and you'll find it. It's outstanding. I mean, it is one of the best pizzas I've ever had. They have another one right by Tiger Stadium there, or Comerica Park. But I definitely recommend checking that out. And the other thing I'll say about Detroit is their Eastern market is something I've never experienced in my life. It's an outdoor farmers market that also has not really the flea in the flea market, because that could be a lot of junk. This is more produce and poultry and beef, right there. And, it's Michigan. So Michigan grows tons of things and they have great agriculture and it's showcased here. And, there's chefs in Chicago, probably Cleveland and surrounding areas that go to this market to get the fresh ingredients that they grow. Certainly they do it for Chicago chefs because it, because some of the restaurants you go to in the city, they'll say, this is, from Detroit, Michigan. And this is where they get it from. They get it from the Eastern market. So it's a really cool, thriving urban oasis right in the Eastern market, which is the east side of Detroit, right there in that neighborhood. And it's an old, warehouse district that has become a thing. And slowly the rebirth of Detroit is happening, at least downtown. And certainly it's got a long way to go. I mean, the city was decimated in terms of what happened to it. But I believe it also had its first population growth since the 60s last year. And things like Sister Pie, another thing you got to check out when you're in Detroit. Pie like you've never had it before. And with traditional flavors that make up this pie place. I mean, you can get like an apple pie, I think, but they blend pies together to give you an experience that you just don't know. And Sister Pie in Detroit, it's in I believe the Indian Village neighborhood, if I'm saying that correctly. I'm checking on my website right now as we're talking, just because I don't want to be an idiot and say the wrong thing. But let's see. But yeah, Sister Pie right there on the corner in Detroit's West Village. I'm sorry, Corner Bakery in Detroit's West Village. I would recommend checking it out. It was fantastic. And there's also a great Vietnamese place that's down the street from that. And there's also a tiki lounge down. I mean, Detroit's full of hidden gems. I can see why so many people from like New York, Chicago are moving there because there's a vibe of that city. And for the first time in my life, when you go to Detroit, you feel its soul once again. So it was a great time. And we were there for a weekend and it felt like we were there for 2 weeks because of good reasons, not bad ones. So thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. I did a whole week's worth of Detroit stories. We'll be back to Chicago next week. There's plenty to talk about with the DNC. That will be next week on these stories from the 78 podcast. Thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. Subscribe if you want. Tell your friends. I'd appreciate it very much. We'll talk soon. See ya.